Morning, everybody. Thank you again for coming to our press conference by Texas Campaign for the Environment. We are really grateful that you all are here this morning and taking the time to learn about our tax abatement study that we've conducted. My name is Dominic Chacon. I am the Regional Houston Coordinator for TCE, and we will have other speakers. Currently, I'm just going to present our findings via this presentation, and then we're going to hear from our list of speakers, and then we will take questions at the end. But if you have any questions in the meantime, please feel free to use the chat function, and we will begin. This is going to be a little bit of what to expect in this presentation, a little bit about who we are, why we do this study, our key findings, and a little bit of the breakdown of the data. So first off, who is TCE? TCE is a statewide organization that stands for Texas Campaign for the Environment. We have various strategies within our organization to organize around the oil, gas, and petrochemical expansion in Texas. And one of our avenues that we organize around are some financial analysis. We have been conducting tax abatement studies in several counties in Texas, and this study is our latest report that we have for Harris County. And our hopes for this resource are to provide data and valuable information to community organizers, organizations, and other folks who, whether or not they're interested in specific environmental issues, they might have an interest in public finance and how to use public dollars for whatever project that they are organizing around. It's important to note that this is a Harris County tax abatement study. Harris County is used to define the region in which we are looking at tax abatement agreements, not to be confused with a study that only looks at Harris County government. So we looked at 3 different tax codes that are managed by all different kinds of taxing entities to explore how public dollars are being transitioned to private industries, specifically oil, gas, and petrochemical industries. The 3 tax codes that we looked at were Industrial District Agreements, otherwise known as IDAs, Chapter 312s, and Chapter 313s. Industrial district agreements are given by cities to create special districts that grant corporations special immunity for permitting processes, zoning laws, and special tax agreements. These IDAs, it's important to note, are new. Houston and Pasadena, the 2 cities that did give out IDAs, are giving them out under this new format. They do not have a record of giving them out in the past. And this is a little flow chart about how they work. They apply for an application, the city approves the application, and instead of taxes, they get a payment in lieu of taxes, otherwise known as pilots. And this creates a certain agreement period in which they receive pilots, and during that period, companies are exempt from all zoning and permit requirements. The other tax code that we looked at are 312s, which are agreements given out by counties and colleges to create tax exemptions for development and redevelopment. These also have pilot payments. But one thing that's important to note is that these agreements also have a number of jobs promised attached to them. And they also get special abatement periods with a special percentage of taxes savings for corporations. The third tax code that we looked at were 313s, which are specifically given by school districts to limit the value of a taxable property of a corporation. And so in this agreement, instead of pilots, there are supplemental payments and revenue protection plans. And our key findings were that roughly $1 billion in total foregone tax revenues was granted to these polluting industries in all of Harris County. Another huge finding we had were that Chapter 313s accounted for about 80% of that $1 billion, roughly at about 800 million. And our study also found that ExxonMobil was the largest recipient of agreements in a total of 200 million. It's also important to note that ExxonMobil had multiple agreements under multiple tax codes. Another key finding for our Harris County study was that the average cost per job promised through agreements amounts to roughly $1.2 million per job, ranging from 31,000 to 39 million. An example of an egregious agreement that was made was Occidental, who promised to bring 2 jobs and received $38.7 million per job that they promised to bring. Lyondell Chemical promised 45 jobs and received about $3.3 million per job promised. And Bayport Polymers promised 16 jobs, receiving 2.9 million per job. And this is a graph to represent the tax incentive totals for all the tax agreements combined. Without agreements, we should be receiving $1.7 billion from these polluting industries. But currently we are only receiving 766 million, which means that these industries, these corporate entities that make billions of dollars of profits every year, are receiving about $1 billion in tax savings. For industrial district agreements given out by the cities, there was about $549 million that we should have been receiving. We only received 378, giving the savings of 170 million for the cities that did give out these agreements. The cities that were giving out industrial district agreements were the city of Houston, the city of Pasadena, and a little bit of the city of Seabrook. You can see here that in comparison to the larger cities where a lot of the industry is, there is a proportionate difference. But the city of Houston in particular lost $92 million within its own city budget that it could have had to spend however they wanted. In the city of Pasadena, they lost $75 million that they could have had to use as a public funding for whatever projects they like. For 313s, these were the school districts that were giving out tax abatement agreements with these industries. We have Channelview ISD. We have Clear Creek ISD, Deer Park ISD, Goose Creek ISD, LaPorte, and Sheldon. And it's important to note that these school districts get into agreements with individual corporations, and the school district might be made whole with whatever supplemental payments these corporations give them. But the general Texas Education Fund is impacted by these agreements with the indiscrepancies in their budgets and how they distribute the funds throughout the state. The good news about this report is that there were no 312s found, meaning that there are no tax abatement agreements between Harris County government and these industries. When we do a little bit of a breakdown of the city of Houston, we see that $92 million was lost. If we distribute that 92 million based on the way the current city council has decided to spend the money, this is where each department could have received that much more money. 62 million for public safety, 1 million for elected officials, administrative services, 3 million, human and cultural services, development and maintenance, and general government business. Wrapping up here, it's important to note that 313 tax abatements laws have now ended, but a new quote unquote zombie tax bill has taken its place. This new tax code is called 403s. The good thing about this new tax law is that there are no more pilot programs that are allowed in this new tax code. However, renewable energies cannot apply to this new tax code, whereas in the past they could. The Texas governor is going to have more of a direct say in agreements. And public hearings are now required for school districts who plan to get into an agreement with future corporations. Whereas before there was no hearing and nobody knew anything. One thing to also note is we have a little bit of trouble with institutional transparency and responsiveness. Whereas other studies we have done, there's a pretty straight line, streamlined process for the custodian of records and for who is responsible for responding to our request for information. But within the city of Houston in particular, there were some overlapping jurisdictions, some bureaucratic hurdles and delay, and legal obstacles that would normally impede any public person trying to access this information. Um, and then lastly, there is still so much information from these tax abatements that can be explored. For example, Texas school public advocates should be keeping an eye out for future tax abatements as we see these new industries such as carbon capture, hydrogen, advanced recycling come into our communities and promise that when we allow them to develop, there's going to be more tax dollars for our communities. This study directly undermines that. Also, public infrastructure with hurricanes, we have a lot of infrastructure that needs money. And so when we hear from our city officials and other taxing entities that there is no money, this undermines that information. And lastly, this is also important for union and labor advocates. Countless times we hear these industries say that these companies are important to our region because they bring economic prosperity and they bring jobs. This directly undermines that message as well. We know none of these workers are receiving millions of dollars per jobs like these companies are receiving. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there. And I'm going to pass it to Stefan, who worked with a group called Autocase, who we commissioned to help get this information and help us conduct the analysis. I'll go ahead and pass it to you, Stefan.
Glad to be here, everyone, and glad to share some of what the process was like to conduct this analysis. So, I'd like to think of this process in three simple phases. So, let's think about the first phase was our investigator phase. This investigation phase was us trying to pursue and see how many agreements existed. Our second phase was our calculation phase. Now, once we received the agreements, we do all the calculation work to see what those foregone revenues were. And then the third phase, I would call it the aggregation phase, or you can call it the bringing everything together phase. So I'll kind of briefly go through each one of those phases. So in our first phase, for the investigation phase, what we typically do is we have our three agreements of focus, our 313 agreements, our 312 agreements, and our IDA agreements. And what we would do is we would pursue all the legal entities, the county, um, the comptroller's office, as well as potential cities in order to determine which one of these entities have agreements. So for our 313 agreements, that was pretty easy because with the 313 agreements, they're required by law to post their agreements and all their information on the Texas Comptroller website. So from that website, we were able to pull all the agreements directly for 313 agreements. As Dom mentioned, for 312 agreements, we reached out to the county, um, and the county apparently did not have any 312 agreements specifically with the industries that we were going industries. However, 312 agreements are not only made with counties, they are made with directly. We were able to find one 312 agreement in our analysis, but the bulk of our were our IDA agreements. The agreements we had about upwards of done in our previous studies, we've had about 10 agreements. So to see upwards of 80 plus agreements was also very shocking because we can see right now that the focus was not necessarily just on big companies, but the focus was that there are a lot of companies, a lot of players involved in these IDA agreements. So after we've pursued the investigation stage and received all our agreements, then we moved on to our calculation phase. But before I move on to the calculation phase, there's something very important to highlight in this investigation phase. Is one thing unique about this particular study is that it was very difficult going back and forth with two primary cities, Houston and Pasadena, as you've seen, with which had the bulk of our IDAs. I would say the majority of our IDAs, about 70 to 80 of our IDAs, came from those two cities. And one of the struggle is that going back and forth to get information took months at a time. Number one. Number two, we would receive information from the cities that was not particularly clear. So you'd get payments of the agreements made, but no idea of which companies made which payment. And then you'd have to go back to the process to request what those companies were. And then they would bring back the information, and then there would be gap years missing. So now, okay, we a little more progress, but there's gap years missing. So then we'd have to reach out to the Harris County Appraisal District in order to fill in those gaps because the city did not have all the adequate information. So I stop here to stress this today because one of the key things in doing this work is to bring clarity to those most affected, which is the community and the individuals living around this area. Now, if me as a professional economist find struggles going back and forth with the city, getting, you know, gaps of information missing, how much more the community members, how much more the taxpayers? So this is something important that we need to stress um, when it comes to bringing clarity of information within our cities so that voters can be informed and that the community most impacted by these agreements can be informed. So that was one big key thing to talk about with this process. So now finally, once we received all the information, we've moved on to the calculation phase. And of course, this is where we pull all the data from the agreements and the payments to see what the companies are actually paying. And then what we do is we read the agreements in detail to understand the terms of the agreement in order to determine the rates that they would be paying versus what they should be paying. And then we compare those two payments, those two payments amounts in our models to get what these foregone revenues are. So you can imagine in this calculation phase, we'll have a list of companies and all the agreements and a lot of numbers for each agreement on what they should be paying and what they are paying. But of course, in this analysis, some of the important work that we want to do is show and display these numbers in different ways. So when we shift to the aggregation phase, that's all about how do we present the data in a way that is helpful for the community to understand. One of those ways is combining the data by company. So sometimes we may want to see, you know, which companies are getting away with it the most. And then we can also combine the data according to agreements, where we're focusing more so on agreements. Which agreements are kind of having the most impact when we look at this analysis? And then we can also break down the information by region. Which regions are actually being most affected by this analysis? So that's kind of one of the things we do when we aggregate the data in a way to present it to the community. One other thing we did do is, and we've done in our previous studies, is it's important to communicate to the community what those dollars actually mean to them. And one of the ways we do that is we take all the foregone revenues, all the savings that the corporations would receive are technically losses to the community. And what we do is we map that over against city budgets in order to determine the different city services that could have been provided with that funds. So we'll break it down usually typically when it comes to community funds that can go to the community, funds that can go to policing, funds that can go to libraries, funds that can go to other charitable work that the city does. And then we can compare how many dollars are being lost for each service. And this is kind of a neat way to get the community to actually understand what they're losing. They're not just losing a dollar amount. What they're losing is a dollar amount in these potential services that could have benefited the city and the community at large. So I think that will be it for now in terms of outlining the process from investigation all the way to our results.
Thank you so much, Stefan. Up next, we're going to have Jen Hedaya, who's the Executive Director of Airlines Houston.
Good morning, and thank you all for being here today. To begin, I would like to commend the Texas Campaign for the Environment for conducting this important study. Important because it provides additional evidence of how certain industries in our communities are not acting as good neighbors, and as additional evidence of the public policies in place that have further enabled them to do so. As we ready for a new legislative session in Texas, knowing how policies directly impact community health is vital. As Dom mentioned, my name is Jennifer Hedaya. I'm the Executive Director of Air Alliance Houston. We are the longest running advocacy nonprofit in the Houston and Harris County area, singularly focused on air quality. We believe everyone has the right to breathe clean air. Core to this mission is to monitor the sources of air pollution through research and to hold those polluters accountable through advocacy. This mission and the aims of this new study being released today are 100% aligned. Many of the same sources of industrial air pollution in the Houston-Harris County area are also reaping the greatest tax rewards. Earlier this year, Air Alliance Houston conducted a study of its own to identify the definitive list of the worst air and climate polluters in Harris County for the past 5 years, what we call the Dirty Dozen, based on 5 different publicly available state and national data sources, including the Toxic Release Inventory, EPA and TCEQ enforcement databases, and risk modeling. You'll see some familiar names on our list from Dom's presentation: ExxonMobil, LyondellBasell, Equistar Chemicals, Celanese. These companies are among the top 12 polluters in the Houston-Harris County region and the top benefactors of public tax abatement policies. Too often, when faced with data on air pollution like this, we are told by industry that their economic contributions outweigh their impact on health and the environment. The study released today from TCE shows that these same industries are preventing economic benefits from returning to the communities they are polluting. Dare I say it, but public tax abatement policies like those discussed today have made it even more profitable for these companies to pollute. We clearly need more protective enforcement of air pollution limits to protect public health, but we also need more protective public policies that keep the public's revenue where it belongs, in our public services and schools, not in the coffers of big polluters. Going forward, we must be diligent in monitoring the next evolution of tax abatements to prevent a repeat of the study's findings. And we must continue to advocate for policies that truly protect public health. Again, I thank you for being here. I commend the TCE for the study. And if you would like to read the Dirty Dozen report from Air Alliance Houston, please visit our website at airalliancehouston.org. Thank you, and I'll turn it back to you, Dom.
Thank you, Jen. Appreciate it. Also, you can find the report in the chat. Just drop the link there as well. Our next speaker is a Houston native and expert in their community and really part of the carbon capture statewide coalition. I'll pass it to Erandi Trevino.
Thank you, Dom. Hi, my name is Erandi Trevino, as you mentioned, and I'm co-founder of the Raíces Collab project, which right now is managing the Texas Carbon Capture and Storage Community Advocacy Coalition. And so with that, what we really aim to do is educate the public on the fact that these carbon capture projects are headed into our communities, and also the fact that they're being funded with public funds. So first, I want to talk a little bit about just the study and how that reflects in Houston and in Harris County, because Houston and Harris County really are the perfect example of the lack of accuracy when it comes to the promises of economic prosperity. The industry that lines the Houston Ship Channel produces almost $1 trillion in revenue. Some of that revenue that heads out into other places around the country. Oftentimes, whenever these revenues are, kind of touted and bragged about, uh, it's it's talked about how some of this funding helps uplift economies all throughout the state and also all throughout the country. But unfortunately, again, that prosperity isn't reflected closest to these industrial activities as they should be. So especially when it comes to tax abatements, if some of the places with the highest number of tax abatements are Houston and Pasadena, that's where a lot of this production is happening, or at least it's right next door to where these productions are happening. And so, for example, we have communities nearby that are making as low as $17,000 per person. And in my neighborhood, it's a little less than 24,000. And unbelievably, my personal property taxes this year were almost a third of that, a third of the average income around the neighborhood. So we can see here that home taxes are extremely high and truly really onerous. And if they can be as high as a third of the average income of the average resident, then that means that they are way too onerous for the people. And when you have trillion-dollar or billion-dollar entities that are getting these tax breaks, um, clearly something here is off. And another thing I wanted to point out is 1 in 5 Texas children goes hungry every day. So we're already looking at a profile for the state where poverty is high. But again, you come closer to these neighborhoods that are making really low incomes, and you look at places like Channelview, that's a heavily industrial town. They have 90% of their population that is financially disadvantaged. So 90% of a population in a town that is primarily industrial. Um, that shows us something, right? So you have these towns that are producing billions of dollars every single year that are getting tax abatements because in theory these industries are supposed to provide high-paying jobs to community members, but unfortunately we see the results that the more industrial a town, the more likely it is that poverty is going to persist. Um, so the reality is that many of our communities are struggling. They're struggling with their health, they're struggling, socially, but really financially, on paper, we can see that they are struggling. And so CCUS, going back to carbon capture, is a perfect example of how a massive amount of public funds can be used for something that people neither asked for, prioritized, or truly need more than anything else, right? So we have some deep priorities, deep-seated priorities in our communities, which are tied to the fact that there is such high levels of poverty. And so in theory, tax abatements or really tax law are meant to incentivize certain activities by these companies. But if the largest incentive is supposed to be to bring jobs into the communities so that money is spent in the community and you can uplift the community through those jobs, even if people aren't working in those industries, that's the theory. Because every dollar spent in a community circulates around the community 7 times. But when that money is spent outside that community, outside the county, it doesn't circulate around that community not any time. So, and that's what we're seeing here. We're seeing that the jobs that are being offered are not the jobs that are actually going to be taken up in those communities. Because the reality is that a lot of times these industries are looking for people who have certain types of expertise, certain types of training, and the path of least resistance is finding it wherever it's available, even if it's outside the community. So for that reason, you see these communities again, I mean, these industries getting tax abatements that are meant to provide jobs and job opportunities for the community. That's in theory supposed to be the reason for them to even exist, but that's not happening. And so really what's happening is, again, there's a loss, there are foregone revenues for the community because the money is being reallocated in a different way. And so if it wasn't for the fact that our environment is being damaged permanently and the health of people around here are also being damaged, really that funding should be used to address issues such as those, to mitigate the impact, the negative impact of those industries versus being spent on jobs that really aren't being, they're never manifesting. And so that's really unfortunate because you have, again, in carbon capture, it's this project that's being led by the Department of Energy, and and really, for example, carbon capture would not be possibility if it wasn't for tax abatement, if it wasn't for it being funded in large part by public funds. About half of each project is going to be funded by public funds. And so if it wasn't for that, it would not be financially viable. It would not be financially attractive for these companies to be engaged in. And yet we don't really even know if they're going to bring real benefits for our communities. In theory, it's supposed to help mitigate the pollution that comes out of these facilities, but a lot of us who are more familiar with carbon capture know that that's not exactly the equation that's going to come out. It's to simply mitigate some of the additional pollution that will be coming with an expansion of these industries. And so, again, in theory, there are these incentives and these goals that are meant to come out of public funding, out of tax abatements. But time and time again, we see that that's not the result. Time and time again, we see that the money is going elsewhere. The money's not circulated inside our communities. Our communities are living in extreme poverty. And, you know, the fact that kids have to go hungry in a place that produces $1 trillion a year is truly unacceptable, especially when there are dollars that should be accounted for, tax dollars that should be coming into our coffers to help mitigate some of those impacts on our community. Yeah, I think that's my time, but I'm happy to answer any more questions about this, especially as related to the fact that we, like, the people need to have a say in where their funding is going. And if they don't have a say at the very minimum, they need to be benefiting in some way from those revenues, and currently they are not.
Thank you so much, Erandi. I really appreciate your perspective. We're going to go ahead and open it up to any questions that you have. Please feel free to raise your hand and we'll go ahead and call on you for questions. And then also, unfortunately, Jen Adaya from Air Alliance had a hard stop, so they had to leave, but they asked to forward any questions to them. So I'll be happy to share any contact information. Oh, and just for reference, you said you live in South Houston, correct, Erandi?
Yes, Southeast Houston.
Southeast Houston, thank you.
Yeah, so I'm down the street from Pasadena, and not far from a lot of these other locations.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the audience today?
I have a
I got
couple.
one.
Go ahead.
Okay, go ahead.
Sorry, I couldn't figure out my hand raise feature was not, it didn't seem to be working. But my name is Cami Farrell. I'm a journalist for Environmental Health News. I just had a quick clarifying question about the study itself. What time periods were assessed? Like what years were we looking at? Or was it just 2024, 2023?
That's a great question. The best way to answer that is it was just a snapshot of current agreements. So some of these agreements exist for upwards to like 10 or more years. So they could be ending within a few years, but also they could have just started and are going to last for many years. And it also is important to note that this snapshot doesn't account for any past agreements that have already been completed, specifically any 313 agreements or any other agreements. But also, there is no record of IDAs being used in the past, so that is new. So yeah,
Thank you, Dom.
no problem. Dave, you had a question?
Couple things. I was told at an earlier location, different job, that the number two for jobs being promised that you referred to at one of the plants
Mm-hmm.
was just a placeholder, not this particular plant, but for another plant, that's what the state required them to put in their initial permit, which I have found, versions of that still online years after they never updated, is what I'm saying. And so that two may or may not be accurate. But when you go into dollars per job, as y'all did in your study, let's see. The other thing was you said there's none in Baytown, none of these agreements in Baytown. Oh, that was the IDAs. No IDAs in Baytown.
Yes, no IDAs in Baytown. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
One, sorry. One thing
No, that's all right.
important to note is that in our past studies, they have been, for example, we did a study in Brazoria County, and in that study, most of the tax abatements were coming from county agreements. Really, one thing that was a huge takeaway was that the school districts were giving out the most dollars here in Harris County.
Okay. I know that they have trumpeted for several years. I don't know exactly when it came in, but a $75 million payment from ExxonMobil to build an athletic facility. And they're still working toward spending the money that way. But there are payments going on. They're just not calling them IDAs, I guess.
Absolutely. There's a to be explored in each agreement, whether or not these sort of revenue protection plans have really balanced out, whether these pilot programs really are amounting to the dollar amount that they're stating. So there is a lot of further analysis that could be done in each agreement. But I think to the bigger point of that is that, public dollars should be determined by public entities in a sort of democratic process, versus, finding a specific project like sports arenas or parks that are sort of sponsored by companies. Those should be paid through sort of the public access to have public input. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Another thing to note I'd want to touch on as well, to think about with these agreements, for this noise, is that we have to think that it affects the public as a whole. When we look at the act with Texas, funds are meant to be distributed in a way in order to help other districts that are poorer get funding as well, so that they can meet up to the standards of other schools. And sometimes what these schools will do in their balance sheet is they will get one of these agreements. It will make like their revenues will drop because they're in that agreement, and because their revenues will drop, it will show up that they don't need to redistribute as much funds back to the state in order to help other schools, and it's kind of an incentive for the schools who do make a little bit more on their sheet if they didn't engage in this to engage in this agreement, have their potential foregone revenues look a little bit different, and then therefore any of that additional funds that they would have gotten without giving the discounted rate wouldn't be going to the other schools, but they would still get a quote unquote benefit from the promises that the companies give. So that's another important thing that I think affects the school district agreements.
Absolutely. And it can't help but connect that to the budget shortfalls that we're seeing across school districts across the region and across the state. I think further analysis could be done to see how much of a budget shortfall is related to these tax agreements.
Could I ask another question?
Absolutely.
Are there any public input opportunities in regards to these, or are they just the public input opportunities newly established under the 403? Have there been any public input opportunities for the IDAs or the 312s or the 313s before that?
That's a great question. To my knowledge, I do not know of anything. The IDAs are particularly new. The cities have been engaging in. And so I think more analysis should be done about what is their process of approval. I anticipate that there is some sort of public input opportunity. Whether or not that's being publicized or is meaningfully engaging is another question. And for 313s, they did not have to have any sort of public input, whereas 403s they do. So that is a new opportunity for organizations and people to interject their voices. And then Robin, I see your hand up.
Yes, I'm Robin Schneider, the Executive Director of Texas Campaign for the Environment, and have been a part of these studies since we started with the one in Nueces County and San Patricio County down in the coastal bend, and then did one in Brazoria County. And on the 312s, there were people who were protesting the ExxonMobil Sabic ethane cracker in San Patricio County, and they found that the county did not give 30 days notice when they granted the tax abatement. This was probably back in 2018, 2017, 2018, 2019, that period. And Texas Campaign for the Environment was not involved, but some of other folks that we work with in the coastal bend were involved. And they actually, the county had to redo the process because they did not give 30 days notice for that abatement. In the end, the county did give the abatement for that project, which is known as Gulf Coast Growth Ventures. However, in the elections that followed, two of the incumbent Republicans who granted those tax abatements lost in their primaries to other Republicans who were not in support of these tax abatements. And the current majority on the San Patricio County Commissioners Court says they will not be giving additional Chapter 312s because they gave away so much public dollars to that project and others that their revenues were really shortchanged. So now my understanding, and I can double check, we can double check, is that the Chapter 403s that the school districts do now also have to have the 30-day public notice that the 312s are required to have. I mean, obviously the school boards needed to vote on these, and Texas Campaign for the Environment folks did contest additional tax breaks from the Gregory Portland ISD for an expansion of the Cheniere LNG export terminal. So it was, it's on a public docket. You have to know to look for it. But now there's that window, a required 30-day window.
Thank you so much for sharing that.
Sure.
Any other questions?
I can also say that we've been tracking these 313s, as have other organizations, and some have been denied. Down in the Cameron County, the Point Isabel School District has been denying tax abatements for the LNG export terminals down there. In addition, in Ingleside, the school district has denied tax abatements for projects, including an ammonia plant that Enbridge and a Norwegian company wants to build export ammonia. And there's been a big controversy in Robstown, Texas, in Nueces County, over tax abatements for a proposed ammonia plant there. And TCE's Political Action Committee actually endorsed and supported candidates who were opposing that tax abatement. And once the newly elected school board member is sworn in, we will have the votes to deny that tax abatement. And the company has said that that could be a deciding factor in whether they go forward with that project or not. So these are important in terms of calculations that these companies make in terms of whether to go forward with projects that could be health and safety issues in communities.
Absolutely. Thank you, Robin. I also want to remind everybody that we did drop the link for the study in the chat. And then we also have our emails and contacts in case you're reviewing the study and have more questions. We're happy to respond and offer any transparency. Thank you, everybody, for attending and having an early morning tax conversation and get our brains chewing on some numbers. We really appreciate it. If there's no more questions, that will conclude our press conference. Thank you all so much for coming.